Okay, let's get started. This is really a dual role. It's the presentations and awards ceremony. And when that wraps up, we will move right on to the presidential address. In a minute, I'm going to hand things over to Robert Moffitt. I just want to take 30 seconds to thank the program committee. I've had a number of people tell me how great the program is and thanking me for creating this wonderful program, and I didn't. The only thing I did was to appoint about 24 fantastic young people to take on different parts of the program, and then let them look at all the submissions in their topic area and make the sessions. And I had to make a few corrections. They were enthusiastic enough that they felt it was fine to put somebody on at 3:30 in the morning. And I didn't do that to any of you. But I do look at their names. I don't want to spend 2 minutes reading out all their names, but they are on the Sully Jolie website, and they really did a fantastic job, and I'm really grateful to them. I also want to thank Bobby Westmoreland and Daniel Stout and their team. This has been a pretty difficult thing to pull together. Everyone's used to doing these things in person. If something goes wrong, you go running to the hotel person who's in charge and say, your audio visual isn't working. That doesn't work quite as well in these remote situations. And we had relatively few bugs today. And I don't think any that were really problematic. So thank you to them for being really responsive and keeping the trains running on time. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to the president of the Society of Labor Economists, Robert Moffitt.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Yes, in fact, while the purpose of this initial session here is primarily to announce the election of new fellows and to bestow 2 of our important awards, I'm going to take the opportunity to say a few things myself of kind of what's going on at Solly, and just as a way of introduction, since this is really the only plenary session I'll be able to say that in. So first of all, I want to give a shout out to Kevin for really having done a tremendous job on organizing this virtual meeting. Virtual meetings are actually, I've done one myself, and I think they're harder than in-person meetings, really. Maybe it's just because the platforms and procedures are still, in development. We are really doing it about a year. But anyway, I think Kevin's done a great job and really a fantastic conference, and both in content and pulling it off. And I'd also like to give a thanks to Bobby Westmoreland and Danielle Stout. Some of you know them, and they are now running Solly, and it couldn't be run without them. So they've done really an outstanding job, and Solly is in great shape in their hands. So I want to make a few announcements, like I said, before the awards and the fellows. One is I want to announce the results of the Solly election. First of all, very happy to say that Catherine Shaw of Stanford University has been elected. She will assume the vice presidency on July 1, which means she's on an inevitable path to both organizing the 2023 meetings, which she'll do in the following second year for a performance service, and then in the third year be president. So that's great news, and Catherine is really, I think, an outstanding choice. Secondly, we have a couple of new members of the board elected. One's Hillary Hoynes of Berkeley, and the other one is Barbara Pedrolo from the UK, as I'm sure you all know. So very happy to have them. And I want to thank the 2 departing board members on July 1, Chris Tabor and Uda Schoenberg, both of whom have done a great job, and really want to thank them for their contributions as well. I just want to say, all of you probably aware too, that Kevin himself will take over on July 1 and become president, and perform those duties for a year. And then also in July, Thomas Lemieux at UBC will take over as president-elect. and he will be organizing the next year's meetings, which will be in beautiful downtown Minneapolis. I say that assuming we will be there in person, so we'll be able to see what it looks like. So, you know, in Passover, there's a saying, next year in Jerusalem. Well, I like to say next year in Minneapolis. Okay, so let's hope we all see each other in person there, and have only limit these virtuals to only two of our meetings. Okay, so finally, I do want to put a little plug here while I have the virtual floor to urge all of you who have joined Solly recently, or a few of you who may have gotten in here and not joined, to please join Solly and renew your membership. There's a lot going on with Solly right now. We're under new management. A lot of new things are being developed, and will continue to be when Kevin and Tomat take over, and Catherine. And if you're a member, you'll be able to keep track of what's going on. You'll receive notices of it. You'll also be able to vote in the elections. You'll get a reduced submission fee to Jolly, and a lot of things that you'll be involved in. And you'll hear about our new code of conduct, our development of an anti-harassment policy, and a lot of other new activities that I anticipate we will be getting for the membership. So please consider renewing and keeping apprised of what's going on. Okay, so let's get to the main event here. And first, I'm going to begin with the announcement of the election of new fellows. If you know the website, and all our past fellows, all our current fellows and past fellows are on the website, Solly website. Solly website, by the way, is new. If you haven't checked it out, I say new relative to when we left Chicago about a year ago. Very, very snazzy. So please check that out. And the election of fellows to the Society is intended to formally recognize labor economists who have made contributions of unusual distinction to the field. And this year, I'm very happy to announce that we have 5 new fellows who've been elected. And let me read them in alphabetical order. Michael Keene from the University of New South Wales, Magni Mogstad from the University of Chicago, Paul Oyer from Stanford, Cecilia Rouse from Princeton, and Kjell Cervantes from Norwegian School of Economics. And they all now become fellows. 4 of them were actually able to be here, and you can on the Zoom, all except CC Rouse, who has a few other things on her plate right now and couldn't really attend. So let me just express the thanks to the fellows for their awards and give them a virtual So thanks, Mike, Magni, and Paul, and Kjell. Feel free to stay on for the entire time, of course. Let me now move to the announcement of the awards. We have 2. Some of our awards are every other year, and some of them are every year. So we have just 2 of them out of our 4 total. There will be more others next year. And the first one I'll consider here is the Solly Prize for Contributions to Data and Measurement. This is a pretty new prize. We've only had 1 award so far. It's intended to recognize how important data and measurement are to labor economics, and to recognize those who have made major contributions to the development of data and measurement. The committee this year was chaired by last year's winner, the first winner, Catherine Abraham, and she was joined by Nick Bloom, Karen Dinan, Erica McIntyre, John Sablehouse, and David Weir. They had a difficult task given how many excellent labor economists we have now who've made such contributions to data measurement. But this year's recipient is John Haltewanger, who's Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Maryland. Now, there's going to be a very long statement posted as soon as possible on our website with all the many accomplishments that John's made. but let me read a very shortened version, and then I'll ask John to make some remarks. So let me read this shortened version of John's contributions. John's Distinguished University Professor of Economics at the University of Maryland. He's a 2021 recipient of the Solly Prize for contributions to data and measurement. Working with administrative data housed at the U.S. Census Bureau, John and his collaborators pioneered the development of measures of job creation and job destruction. He's been central to the creation of Census Bureau data products, including the longitudinal business database, the LDB, the business dynamic statistics, the BDS, and the new business formation statistics, the BFS. John also has mentored and collaborated with dozens of younger scholars, many of whom have gone on to do their own important work related to the measurement of economic activity. Given these many contributions and their importance to both the research and policy community, John is eminently deserving of this year's Data and Measurement Prize. So John, I'd like to invite you to make some remarks if you'd like to.
Sure, I'll make a few remarks. First, I'm very much honored to get this award. This is it is a great surprise and very much honored. I mean, labor economics and labor economists have been at the forefront, I think, of data and measurement in the economics community. I'm not saying the other disciplines aren't as well, but particularly in terms of, I'd say, development of data at both the micro and the macro level. Labor economists have truly been at the forefront. In my, I don't need to tell this group, this very distinguished group here, that much of that development has really been more on the household and the worker side, and we continue to need further development and work. But again, the kinds of panel data sets or even just repeated cross sections that have been made available have been fantastic, and then the econometric methods that have gone along with that. And I think what we've done, I'll say myself in particular, with lots of colleagues, particularly at Census, but there's also folks at BLS who've done some very nice things, but also you could say now increasingly at IRS and SSA, is we've tried to follow in that tradition in terms of having longitudinal business databases. And so we made enormous progress I'd say in this country, both in longitudinal business databases and matched employee data. I think one of the things we've worked very hard on is both the kind of public domain products that Robert just talked about, but also micro databases that can be used for the kind of research and analysis that the household panels are so well known for. A key challenge, of course, which we're still working on, is access, right? Because a big difference is it's very, very difficult to put micro data on businesses into the public domain. Basically, you quickly figure out, given the skewed size distribution of activity, if you have the micro data, basically who's who. And so that's been a huge challenge, and I've also worked on that. I think that's actually something else that I'll say the profession needs to continue to work on is finding ways of not only developing these data sets and these new data products, but also getting access. So I'll stop there and just say again, I'm very honored, particularly in general, but particularly given this is from the labor economics community.
Thanks, John. Okay, second prize, let me describe that one and the recipient. The second one is the Jacob Mincer Award for Lifetime Achievement to the field of labor economics. This is the Society's really highest and most prestigious award. And if you go to our website and see the roll call of people who've received this award, it's the giants, really, of labor economics going back to the beginning. So it's really a very distinguished prize. The committee this year was chaired by last year's recipient, Richard Bundle, and he was joined by Martha Bailey, Nicole Fortin, Mike Keene, Lance Lochner, and Kathleen McGarry. They had also a very difficult task given how many labor economists have made enormous lifetime contributions. This year's winner is Kenneth Wolpen, recently retired as Distinguished Research Professor and Lay Family Professor of Economics at Rice University. Once again, there's going to be a very long statement of Ken's lifetime contributions posted on the SOLI website, but let me read a shortened version, take a minute to do that. Although I think all of you are familiar with Ken's many contributions, but let me describe them for you in case you haven't been part of economics in the past few years. Ken's pioneering work in dynamic structural modeling achieved many firsts. His 1984 JPE paper on fertility and child mortality, and his 1987 econometric paper on school-to-work transitions of young men were pioneering applications of the dynamic discrete choice approach. His 1999 Review of Economic Studies paper with Zvi Eckstein estimated the first structural model of women's labor supply in which wages are endogenous as they are altered by work experience. His 1997 Journal of Political Economy paper with Mike Keene took the human capital investment framework of Mincer and Becker seriously for explaining data on educational and occupational choices in labor supply. And there are many more. His scholarship has also shaped the literature on natural experiments and data collection. Well ahead of its time, his work is on some of the earliest economics to leverage naturally occurring exogenous variation to test hypotheses and identify model parameters. He's also made important contributions toward improving key data sets used by labor economists, including the National Longitudinal Study, the Health and Retirement Survey, the Early Childhood Longitudinal Survey, the Panel Study on Income Dynamics, and the High School and Beyond Survey. In sum, Ken's numerous contributions to labor economics, which encompass methodological innovations, careful empirical work, investment in data collection, make him a truly worthy recipient of the Jacob Mincer Prize for Lifetime Achievement in Economics. So thanks, Ken. I'd like to invite you to make a few remarks if you'd like.
Okay, yeah, sure, thank you. So when Robert informed me of this award, I was quite surprised. I mean, all you have to do is take a look at the previous Mincer Award recipients to realize how great an honor it is to be placed in that company. I thank Robert and the SOLI Mincer Award Committee for recognizing my work as being worthy. I was lucky to have been a graduate student when Jacob Mincer and others were pioneering the human capital revolution. I met him as a graduate student and saw him present his original work on the development of the Mincer earnings function. I remember having a copy of the manuscript that later became his seminal book, Schooling Experience and Earnings, and I remember reading at that time all of his papers. He helped to lay a foundation, not only for my work, but for all of modern labor economics. When you receive an award such as this for lifetime achievement, it's natural to think back about all of the people who have professionally and personally contributed to that accomplishment. In my case, the list would be very long. It would include more than a few of the previous Mincer recipients, as well as many others. But to keep this brief, I'd like to mention only two in particular, both unfortunately recently deceased. The first is Finus Welch. Finus was the chair of my dissertation committee and was as responsible as anyone for my becoming an academic. The second is Eddie Lazier. After graduate school, I spent 2 years at Chicago as a postdoc, coinciding with Eddie's first 2 years as an assistant professor. I was extremely fortunate to have been able to spend many, many hours with Eddie just talking economics. Both Finus and Eddie are really great losses. So just in closing, let me just simply acknowledge my great appreciation for this award. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you a lot. And let me just extend one more word of congratulations to all our 5 new fellows and to John and to Ken, who all 7 exemplify the best of labor economics and make me at least very proud to be a labor economist and a part of our thriving field. And I look forward to all the future recipients when I see all the new labor economists who are coming to Solly and presenting interesting papers, and look forward to continuing the field and the great work that's being done. So that ends the fun part. The next part's not so fun. But I'm going to turn things over to Kevin to, I guess, move on to the next part of this session.
Imagine you can hear me better if I unmute. So thank you, Robert. And also apologies to a couple of people who I was trying to promote Chell to a panelist because he entered through the webinar and not as a panelist. And I accidentally promoted a couple of other people because the names kept moving too quickly. So I wasn't trying to put you on the spot. In any event, we're going to move, as Robert said, we're moving on now to the presidential address, and I'm very pleased to introduce Robert Moffitt, the president of the Society of Labor Economists. Robert is the Krieger Eisenhower Professor of Economics at Johns Hopkins University. Before joining Hopkins, he was a professor of economics at Brown University. Robert is unquestionably one of the outstanding labor economists of, I wrote his, but maybe I should say our generation. He is one of the leaders in the study of tax policy and poverty, particularly the interaction between implicit and explicit taxes and the welfare system. I want to say, many years ago, when I had not been working at all on poverty, I started teaching a course on poverty and discrimination in the United States. And your JEL paper on the incentive effects of the welfare system was just critical to my being able to understand and to teach the issues. Again, from a personal perspective, I think your paper on the value of food stamps is a truly great paper. And I'm sort of surprised. I mean, I understand that you have lots of other great hits. I think that should be up there with some of those other major papers you've written. I don't want to suggest that Robert has only worked on welfare programs. With the late Peter Gottschalk, he did pioneering work on earning stability, and he's made very important contributions to econometric methods. Robert's received a really large number of well-deserved honors. To mention only a few, he's an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a fellow of both the Econometric Society and, of course, the Society of Labor Economists. He's been very active in professional service. He's a past president of the Population Association of America, former editor-in-chief of the American Economic Review and of the Journal of Human Resources. And he served on an approximately infinite number of scientific advisory committees. I was just blown away when I looked at the list. Now I have to say, I had not interacted much with Robert before I became solely vice president. But I'd heard a great deal about him from our mutual friend, Peter Gottschalk, and from his sister-in-law, who in the small world model happens to be the best friend of my high school girlfriend. And so it's been a great pleasure getting to know you, Robert, and working with you. And I'm looking forward to your presidential address on the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic recession on women's human capital, some projections. And let me just remind people that you can use either the Q&A or the chat to ask questions. I prefer the chat. It makes it easier for me to only monitor one thing, but either way, it's fine. And with that, Robert, I turn it over to you. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Thanks for that generous introduction. I would also, I guess, like to really quickly just say, I'd like to dedicate this talk to my dear friend, Peter Gottschalk, who passed away in March of Parkinson's disease. He was one of the nicest guys I've ever known, an excellent economist, and a very great collaborator. So it's a great loss, and I still miss him. I miss him every day. So just one more loss to labor economics this year, among many. Okay, well, let me then proceed, and I will share my screen here if I can. Okay, so I, done more work on poverty and welfare programs than anything else. No question about that, as Kevin said. Believe it or not, I have occasionally in my career touched on women's labor supply and maybe more single mothers because of the connection to poverty and welfare programs. But I did some early work on fertility models for women and marriage. And then every once in a while, I'll come back to it. And so for my talk today, I'll come back to it again, although with some trepidation, given how many unbelievably good economists today are working on women's labor supply. There's more every month, it seems like it. So I'm dipping my toe into the waters here a little bit and hope it's not overly naive. But it's a little different topic than most of the other work that's being done today. First of all, it is on COVID, and there's a lot of work being done on COVID, including on women, which I'll cite in a minute. And then it's also one particular aspect of COVID that I don't think has been examined. And it's also not really about all the work, tremendous work, and Claudia talked a lot about it, for example, in her Reese lecture a minute ago about the gender gap, the motherhood penalty, and all the interesting issues that are going on in that area. So it's a little different. So anyway, it's an idea, and I'm going to take my time here to just explain what I and my co-author have done. And let me say immediately, it's a work in progress. So I'm very interested in comments, either at the end of my talk, if we have time, and I'm also completely open to emails to me for suggestions or things I've done disastrously wrong. So please, if you have thoughts, please convey them to me at some point or in any fashion, including email. Okay, so the title, The Effect of COVID-19 Pandemic Recession on Women's Human Capital, Some Projections. This is co-authored with Xinyu Zhao, who's a graduate student, a very talented graduate student at Johns Hopkins. And as the title says, I want to study, and we are going to do an exercise here in estimating and projecting, that's the key word there, projecting what the effect of the pandemic recession might be on women's future human capital. And that's a very ambitious task. And we would, I want to say immediately, have no pretense that we're going to be able to capture all of this. In fact, the exercise we're going to report here is extremely simple and is nothing more than kind of an exercise to see what you might get if you took the most basic model in economics, which is the Minsurian wage equation, and you try to use that to project the effect of the pandemic recession on women's human capital, as I'll explain. Okay, so what's the idea? This is what I said. There's been a tremendous amount of research by economists on the pandemic already. In fact, I can't keep up with it all. I don't know anyone who can keep up with it across all different dimensions, macro, micro, health, epi models, all kinds of stuff. Incredible outpouring of work. The joke I've heard is there's actually more papers on COVID than there are cases now. So anyway, a lot of that has been actually on the labor market, and in a lot particularly on women's labor market. So I'm going to hold off on citations in a little bit, a few slides, hold on, and I'll give you what I know, and I'm not even sure I know everything. But there's been work on particular aspects of this pandemic related to women. One of them is, and again, I'm sure there are many of you who follow this literature, so you know all this. There may be a few of you out there who don't have full time to read everything, but if you haven't read it, what has been really emphasized in the literature so far is that the particular industries that have been hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic recession are ones where women are disproportionately employed. Leisure and hospitality industries are, for example, one. Transportation, a lot of women work in the airlines, for example. Restaurants, dining, even retail. And this has made quite an impact on women and is quite different than the typical recession we faced in the past. This is not new to me. This is what everyone who's worked on this has kind of emphasized and recognized. And of course, the impact of childcare closings and the school closings has been studied by labor economists, and I think everyone's aware of that just by either through their own experience or by reading the daily papers. So this is all known, but there's two other factors that make this particular recession quite different in its impact on women than past recessions. It's also been documented that the impact has been, the negative impact on employment is much greater for less educated women, and that's also not too surprising. There's been quite a bit of discussion of the fact that more educated women are often able to telecommute and keep their jobs and keep working from home, for example. I'll say a few more things about that, but not a lot. This paper is not really about working from home. Even as important as that is, it's not about that. So, but I will talk about it and refer to it now and again. Okay, so as I said at the beginning, I'm just going to report a few projections. And I want to emphasize that word projections. Everybody knows I don't need to emphasize this. You know, projections are not the same as predictions. Projections are conditional upon a model, and they're conditional upon what might happen in the future. And that's all this is. You know, we'll wait and see what happens in reality. But we're interested in the effect of the recession on human capital, and we're going to measure that by market wage rates. So there is a distinction there, of course, between market wage rates and earnings. Earnings have labor supply in them. And a lot of the work that's been done that I'll refer to later has been assessing the impact of various alterations in women's employment on future earnings. This is a little bit different than that because I'm looking at wage rates. And I think that's the more common measure of human capital per se. The idea is incredibly simple and intentionally simple. I actually don't want to, I and Jinyu intentionally don't want to get too complicated here. We're going to make this a simple exercise as possible. And for that purpose, we're going to use Mentorian wage equations. And Mentorian wage equations, you know, is a building block of our field. They just say that experience squared or some polynomial in experience affect your current human capital, and therefore the wage rate, given whatever rental rate there is on human capital, what you can obtain in the labor market. And so it's not more complicated than that. Now, there's been a lot of sophisticated models of human capital going way beyond Mincer. I don't need to tell this audience that. I'm not going to do any of those. We're going to do the Mincer wage equation here. And so I could have titled, Zinni and I could have titled the paper, what does a Mincer wage equation imply about the impact of the pandemic recession on women's future human capital? But that's basically the subtitle. Okay, so the idea is really simple. Experience losses from the pandemic recession, and that simply changes the wage. So the basic idea is no more complicated than that. But there are going to be some COVID-specific aspects to our exercise that aren't there usually. One is the industry impact, as I noted before, particular industries that have been present, predominant or disproportionately affected by the pandemic recession. Do those affect human capital more than other industries, so human capital women? What about telecommutable jobs? Does that matter to the human capital impact? And those things I mentioned before, the childcare closures and the school closures, do those have a particularly different impact than you might usually expect during a recession, a normal recession, whatever that is? I'm sure there are macroeconomists out there who tell me that no recession is ever the same. Everyone's different. I'm going to assume they're all the same. The past ones are the same. What about their husbands? There's been some work done of that, of course. And of course, there's the classic, discouraged worker and added worker impact of husbands But it may be more than that because the pandemic has affected men too in somewhat different ways than other recessions, and that may affect the women as well. So I'm trying to, Xingyu and I are going to try to incorporate some of these into the Mincer model, into our model, let's put it that way, and see what effect they have on our estimates of human capital losses. So the idea is this, again, very traditional exercise in many respects, which is you estimate a Mincer wage equation. And I'm going to use pre-pandemic data. We've got a lot of recessions out there that have occurred already. And we're going to try to incorporate the unique aspects of the COVID pandemic into past recessions to the extent that we can. And then we're going to treat experiences endogenous. And Eckstein and Wolpen are the, as I mentioned a minute ago in the summary of Ken Wolpen's many achievements, they're the first ones who actually seriously wrote down the model of endogenous experience. So we're going to treat it as endogenous. Now, the simple part of this is basically use linear IV, okay? Nothing fancy here. And we're going to instrument experience with business cycle variables, okay? So when the unemployment rate goes up or when there's a downturn, that affects experience. What impact does that have on future wages, okay? So that's the simple idea. Estimate that on past recessions, and then turn around and plug in the pandemic recession and forecast what wages would be under the assumption that things are going to remain the same. And at the end of the talk, I'm going to list the 100 different ways why that's probably wrong, and why this recession is probably different than all past recessions. What's one of the papers I'll cite is titled "This Time It's Different," but anyway, I'm going to assume they're the same. So that's an exercise. What if things were the same? If things were the same in this recession as in past recessions, what would be the impact on women's human capital? That's the nature of the exercise. I want to make one aside here that Xingyu and I have talked about, which is that, there's a big, the number of Mincer and wage equations out there that have been estimated are probably in the tens of thousands. And a very large number of them do take into account the endogeneity of the experience variable, experience squared in the Mincer equation. As far as we could tell, we couldn't find a single paper where the effect of the unemployment rate, let's say, as the leading indicator of the business cycle, the effect of the unemployment rate per se on job loss, experience loss, and therefore human capital was isolated by itself, okay? And I'd be love it if somebody knows that. It might be more in macro than in micro. Now, there has been some work done on the impact of recessions on long-run wages, particularly well-known paper by Steve Davis and Til van Wachter estimating the effect of the Great Recession, but it was only on mass layoffs. It followed up on the whole, the old literature on the displacement effect. That's what it was coming out of. But that's not really what we're talking about here. Although there is a mass layoff connection, but to the pandemic recession, but I don't think it's the same. There's been much more work on the motherhood wage penalty, which what Claudia was talking about, and so many great papers have been done so far. I'll give you a few cites later, but there's just too much to cite. But I titled this slide an aside because it's just kind of throwing out a question there, which Xingyu and I are not going to address, which is there any reason to expect that a job loss from a recession will have any different impact on future human capital than, let's say, taking time off to have a child or to child rear at home? After all, work is work, and if you spend 10 weeks away from your job, does it matter what the reason is? We raised the question. I think it's interesting. You can think of a lot of reasons why they're quite different, but I think it's an interesting question. But it's not one we're going to address here because we're just going to use the unemployment rate, but just the business cycle. I'll talk about what business cycle variables we'll use, but that's all we're going to use to identify the experience effect and absolutely nothing else. Okay, some other feature of the exercise. Sorry to say, this is only going to be about less educated women. Claudia was only about college educated women. Anyway, for reasons, we're going to use the PSID, and anyway, for sample size reasons, we're going to have to look only at low educated women. On the other hand, they're the women who've been more affected by the pandemic recession. We're going to stratify completely by marital status in the presence of children. Albanese and Kim have already done that. So whether you're married, whether you have kids, all the literature shows how different the labor force behavior is of women by presence of children, marital status. And so we're going to allow the human capital impact to also be different for all such groups. And we're going to have panel data. We're using PSID. We're not going to use the CPS and any other repeated cross-section. The PSID has great advantages and great limitations too. For anybody who's ever worked with the PSID, you know what I'm talking about. So I'll explain how that comes in. Okay, so let me speed up a little bit because I do have stuff to go there. So the results preview are that we're going to look only 1 year out, and I'll talk about going farther out, but we're only look 1 year out after the pandemic recession of 2020, and ask how are 2021 hourly wages affected by the experience of the pandemic. And what we are going to get are about 1 to 2% reductions in the hourly wage in 2021 from the job losses experienced by women in 2020. And I'll explain exactly how we do that calculation. We do find the impacts are largest for mothers, the women with children, and they're smallest for women without children. Maybe that's not surprising either, given everything that's been written. We do find, in fact, that the impacts are larger if the woman is in a industry which was hit hard by COVID. And just to be clear here, so we're using historical data to get that impact, and then we're projecting forward into 2020 and 2021. And then on school closures and childcare, we don't have really good PSID data to really calibrate that in the past. I mean, to actually estimate their impact in the past. We've got a little bit more to do on childcare. There's a little bit of childcare data, but there's nothing. I mean, there's never been a school closure like we had in 2020. So we're just going to do some calibrations there, some kind of guesstimates for what the impact of childcare and school closure are going to be. And the calibrations need more work. I'll say that in advance, but certainly our kind of first cut at it suggests that the impacts on future human capital might be quite a bit greater for those of women, for women with school-age children, and even school-age children more than preschool children for reasons I'll describe. Okay, so let me run through a few slides. Again, if you follow the COVID literature, this is all old news. If you haven't, hopefully it'll be of some interest. So here's a nice little graph I got from a hand worker. I updated it. It shows the unemployment rate in past recessions by the duration. So the horizontal axis here, down here is the months since the past recession, since the beginning of the recession. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So in the pandemic recession, we're about 12 or 13 months into it. So here we are. The unemployment rate went way up and then came right down very quickly. We're still at an unemployment rate above where we were back in the beginning, which is February 2020. But you see how different this recession is from past ones. The blue line here is the Great Recession. You see how slowly it began and then how long it took before it returned. This gray one right here is the early 1980s. So it wasn't nearly as long as the Great Recession, but it actually did peak at a higher unemployment rate than we ever experienced during the Great Recession. Then all the other recessions are down here. So to me, this is the biggest problem with what we're doing. Obviously, this recession is very, very different than the others. And whether we're able to capture that, very, very questionable. I would say that's probably the greatest limitation of what we're going to do. So as you'll see. Okay, so a couple of things here from Albanese and Kim on the employment reductions by marital status and the presence of children, which I want to talk about because these are exactly the same 4 groups we're going to use here: single women without children, single with children, married without children, and married with children. And you see early on, it looks like single mothers, were the ones who had the greatest employment reductions later on, there were others. Well, actually, married women with children were slightly greater. They've all kind of gone down on average, but single mothers do appear to be affected the most. So this is just one piece of evidence that stratifying and separating the analysis by those groups is important. There's a lot of work showing that these differential impacts are still with us as of May 2021. They're still here, so they're going away, but very slowly. So 2021 is certainly going to be also affected, and maybe we'll update the analysis after that. What else here? Something on childcare closures. Okay, so what do we have? Adults 25 to 64. What's the percentage of adults with children who are not working because of childcare issues? 30%, almost 1/3 of adults who are having child are not working. This is when is this? Forgotten exactly what period this was. Early in the pandemic. So the time period, but nevertheless, that's a big number. That's a big number. 1/3. Also makes it quite different. 93% of households with school-age children. Of course, some of distance learning, that was also early on. Of course, all the schools closed, so maybe it's only surprising it's not 100%. So that's not the whole year. So this is an issue with what we're doing. Okay, what else? Industry is hard hit. This is just this figure only shows what I said before. Hotels and motels. Big, this is from February to June of last year, 40% reduction, in employment, air transportation, the airlines, 25%, food service and dining, minus 25%. Women are disproportionately represented in these industries, and so that will have a disproportionate impact as well. Women disproportionately concentrated in flexible, high contact industries, hard-hit industries. Okay. Final slide, the low wage workers. So what you see here is the reduction in employment. And this is kind of underestimates of the actual monthly, because we're going from February 2020 to February 2021. And by February 2021, we've already, the unemployment rate dropped dramatically and employment has grown. But even by that time, low wage workers, minus 11% reduction, much greater than those of middle skilled workers. Actually kind of interesting. It's actually by February 2021, we have a positive impact for high skilled workers. So the very different impacts clearly by skill level. So real quickly, some citations here, very, I'm sure, inadequate and incomplete. There've been a bunch of papers on COVID in women, and these are only a few of them. This one is pretty well known. They pointed out all the industry impacts and occupational impacts that I've already cited. Have a model of husband-wife bargaining, particularly focusing on whether men took up any slack in the home work and child rearing during the pandemic. Another paper here, particularly on child care. Then Van Wachter has actually gone ahead and taken those old estimates of the impact of the Great Recession on future wages and applied them to the pandemic recession and gotten some pretty big negative impacts. I'll say more about that. Hedgenes has an interesting paper on mothers per se. Albanese Kim, I've already referenced several times, showing the impact differential by marital status and children and also by occupation. Another paper here on cross-country comparisons. Bick and Blandon have some tracking data. Dan Aronson, Luajahu, and Rajan have all looked only at women and showed that the negative employment impacts and earnings impacts were disproportionately felt by single mothers, which we kind of saw already from that Albanese Kim table. And the less educated, we saw that one too, but also Black mothers had disproportionately negative impacts. Women in business cycles, there's been a lot on how that's been changing over time. Only two citations here. Closing the gender gap. and also how the growth of female employment has actually changed the nature of business cycle. It's kind of an interesting paper. The scarring effect of recession. So my final mention of this paper, I've already mentioned it twice, Davis and Halterwanger, comes out of the placement literature. It's the only thing out there, and to be honest, I just don't think it's really that relevant to the pandemic recession. It was all about mass layoffs, and only if you were long tenure. And that's where they find the really large negative impacts of the Great Recession. And in the pandemic recession, I guess you could say we've had mass layoffs because a lot of firms have laid off everybody and just closed down, and some of them closed permanently. So I guess that's a mass layoff. But it doesn't seem to me to be quite the same as the idiosyncratic and even industry-specific shocks that have been studied in that displacement literature. I may be wrong, but it doesn't seem to me. But again, if anybody has any other estimates of the impact of recessions or unemployment on future wages, please email me. And then the vast literature, this is just kind of embarrassingly short in the citations. But obviously it is relevant to what I'm talking about. I raised the question earlier. This Otta, Dustman, Stevens paper that I've listed down here is kind of interesting because it showed that women who take time off to have children and who return, we know that they, at least initially, have lower wages, but they seem to say that the argument, that the impact was really large only for women in so-called abstract occupations, using what the by now familiar classification of occupations by type, skill type, and not so much lower educated women. So we're going to study lower educated women in here. So that result may or may not follow from what we're going to be doing. So, but we'll see. I'll show you the results. Okay, so so what we're going to do here, let me quickly report what we what we've done so far. As I said, it's kind of work in progress. So PSID, panel data, women, 25 to 54, 1993 to 27. I'll say later why we only started in 1993. The PSID goes much farther back than that. And as I say, we're going to stratify these 4 groups here without, of course, you know, we're assuming exogeneity here for marital status and for a childbearing, which I'm sure is not quite correct. And then we went with a twofold education classification. And once we looked at the PSID data and we divided it by these 2 education groups and by these 4 marital status categories, the number of women in the college category was just too small. So anybody who uses the PSID knows that if you start stratifying much, you get down to small ends. PSID is actually not a big data set. So we rather reluctantly, we just dropped the college educated women, and this is only about lower educated women, and hopefully maybe we can get some other data sets which are larger to study the more educated women. Okay, so and then I have something down here at the bottom on, okay, if we're doing only less educated, how does that change our expectations? Well, we know the employment impacts were, negative employment impacts were larger for the less educated women, so we know that. However, we're looking at the effect of human capital, and there's another large literature shown repeatedly that the age earnings profiles of less educated men and women are much flatter than those for more educated men and women. And who knows, maybe for low educated workers, there's not much impact on human capital of being away from work, given the types of jobs they hold or away from. So we'll see. We don't find zeros. Okay, so hourly wage rate, years of work experience and work experience squared, we're just straight Mincer here. We are going to try different, separating out that experience into full-time experience and part-time experience. And I have some data issues here. It turns out to be really kind of messy to construct these histories from the PSID data. You would think it'd be easy because you've got all the panel data, but the PSID went biennial, they skipped years, and some women came in who weren't there before. Actually, Fran Blau and Larry Kahn did a lot of work on this. We built on their work, their JEL survey on the gender gap. They used the PSID and also had to go to quite a bit of work to construct. Anyway, we did it. So here's the equation we're talking about. Log wages function of X beta, experience squared. Up, you know, so this is wage at time T, but right up to T, so it's kind of lagged experience, okay? Years of work experience. And there are three econometric issues here I'll quickly mention, all familiar. One is we're going to have workers only, so you've got a conventional Heckman selection bias problem here. We've done a little on that, and to be honest, we haven't finished, so I'm not going to report any estimates with Heckman or any other kind of selection bias adjustments. My reading of the literature is that, at least in the typical case, those adjustments make some impact on the magnitude of the coefficients, but don't change their signs or have large changes. But it's a big literature, so you can get diverse results. Speaking here again econometrically, you could ensure that this error term here is positively correlated over time. And you could represent that in many different ways. The textbook way is by random effects model, which would affect the standard errors and everything here. We haven't done that yet either. But the main one we're interested in more than anything is the endogeneity of experience squared. And we're going to instrument that, as I said repeatedly, with the business cycle. That's our focus here. Eckstein-Wolfman's the classic reference. So that's our focus here. And that's because that's where the business cycle effect comes in. Okay, so what are we going to use for, we'll just quickly say, it turns out we tried the unemployment rate and using that as the instrument. Actually, it doesn't perform that well in predicting job loss during any year, not nearly as well as employment shocks. So we're doing everything state specific here. So we have state specific unemployment rates and state specific employment shock variables. The employment shock variables come from BLS data on employment by state over time. And there we just construct the shock variable by constructing a deviation from trend. So are you in a state where employment suddenly dropped from trend or rose from trend? And what impact does that have on work and experience? It turned out the employment was much stronger than the unemployment rate. So that's what we're going to use as our measure, many different measures of business cycle. So I'm not sure how much difference it would make, but the employment is what we're going to just say quickly. So anyway, business cycles variation, again, for the 10th time, the experience coefficient in the Mincer equation is identified only by that and not by anything else. Okay, so, but let me just say, digress on that for 1 minute, and what the implications of that is. Maybe this is why nobody's been foolish enough to do what we're doing. But the if you want to use only business cycle variables as the instrument, we know from basic econometrics that means that everything else in that first stage experience equation has to be in the wage equation. You can't leave anything out, or else you're going to be identifying the experience coefficient from other variables in addition to business cycles. So let me give you an example of what that means. Say age of children. Okay. Age of children has got to go into the first stage experience equation. We know that, and we do it, and it's a very, very significant variable. I've got to put it in the wage equation too, because if I didn't, it would help identify the experience coefficient. But if you put the age of children into the wage equation, you're kind of changing the interpretation of what that experience coefficient is. You're conditioning it on that. Now, I'm already assuming marital status and the presence of children is exogenous by stratifying, but still, the question of how far you want to go with that. And even another example is take that variable we're interested in here on whether the woman is in an industry that was hard hit by COVID, okay? I want to put that into the first stage experience equation. Well, I've got to put that into the wage equation too. And same thing for telecommutable occupation or any IO variables you want. Otherwise, they will identify the experience, help identify the experience coefficient. I don't want to do. Xinu and I do not want to do that. So that again is going to change the interpretation of the experience coefficient in the wage equation. It's going to be conditional upon those things. You might certainly worry about endogeneity there, and that the population that you're studying here is kind of self-selected in some way. That's certainly true, and the coefficients will be for that self-selected occupation. But I think it's required, unless helpful comments on this, but I think by the nature of the exercise and what we're trying to do here, I think it's required. Okay, so I said we have these COVID-specific variables, whether you've been in an industry that was later hard hit by COVID, in a telecommutable occupation. We've got some variables in there for the spousal work. We have child age variables, time trend. Let's skip all that stuff. Okay, so the here are the some descriptive stats. We have these 4 groups, demographic groups. The mean real wage in 2010 dollars. Okay, I mean, these are not minimum wage workers, at least that mean. So they have less than college. Okay, so got a lot of high school graduates here and a few people with some college. The full-time experience is kind of interesting. Not surprisingly, women without kids have many more years of experience than women with kids. Now, I'm not controlling for age here, so we know that marital status varies with age. So you're picking up people at different points in their life cycle. So these observations, pooled observations and cross-sectional observations you see, I would love for these to be bigger than they are. And we're kind of down to where I don't want to stratify it any more than this. So, okay, more detailed specification. Okay, we have 2 first stage equations for experience and experience squared, separately for full-time and part-time. We've got that state-specific employment shock that will appear in the experience squared equations, and also those industry and occupation dummies. And we've got to also take for married women, the husband's work. We're going to treat that as endogenous. We have another equation, first stage equation for that. We're going to instrument the husband's work with state-specific trends in male-dominated industries on the presumption that's been really demonstrated in that literature I talked about, that men are in very different industries than women. And we have some data on specific industries, so we're going to use that as an instrument. And of course, we're going to, for the children, preschool, 6 to 12, which is basically primary school, and 13 to 17 for the teens. So, these are going to be very significant, obviously, in women's work and experience. So, so initial results, I'll just describe in words. The wage equations, interestingly, the years of past part-time work, years of part-time experience, completely insignificant all the time. Every specification never affects your future wage. And it's a low wage sample and may not extend, to higher educated women. Depends on what kind of part-time jobs they do. But it may be very specific to the low wage sample. But the kind of jobs they're in, if you just work part-time, it doesn't really improve your skills much at all. It's not a new finding. If you follow the literature, there's at least one paper I've seen, this paper in Econometrica by Richard Blundell and Monica Costas-Diaz and Costas-Gear and Kevin Shaw, that showed that also no impact of part-time work on future hourly wage rates. Anyway, that's what we find. And so we're just going to drop it. We just drop part-time. Full-time experience, on the other hand, has the expected quadratic trend. So this can be a little bit different, but depending on your marital status, child group. And we also find the experience equation, those employment shocks are paused. I mean, they have the expected sign. Not, hopefully that's a reassuring finding. They do single mothers seem to be the most cyclically sensitive compared to the other groups. Maybe that, is a more general result in the Albanese Chem table I showed you before, where single mothers were very strongly affected. The industry does matter. If you're in one of these industries that is hard hit by COVID, the hospitality, transportation, dining, these kinds of things, a negative shock has a much greater impact. So that does come in. The telecommutable was not strong. And I'll have to talk to some of the experts in here, because if you look at those telecommutable occupations, a lot of them are edgy schools. I mean, I guess you can teach online. So, but still, I was kind of surprised, and that may be the reason why low wage workers, at least. Remember, we don't have highly educated telecommutable workers here, just low skill workers. Okay. The age of children has your expected effect. If you have 0 to 5 as your youngest child, very big negative effects on experience. 6 to 12, small, negative, but not as big, and smallest if your youngest child is 13 to 17. Everything here is not surprising. The husband work, interesting, was not all that significant. I mean, significant, seemed to be positive on experience. So maybe that's just positive as sort of a mating, or maybe it's the added worker effect. I don't know. We're not going to go into any real structure interpretation here. It may be also that the ends here are just a little bit too small to really have enough power to pick up those effects. It was sometimes significant for some groups and some specifications, but just not as often as you might expect. Okay, here are some results on the what you get if you from our kind of baseline specification. So remember, we're getting instrumental estimates of the coefficient on experience and experience squared. And these are separated by our 4 groups. And these down here for the married mothers and the unmarried mothers and unmarried childless, you know, they're, first of all, you know, the quadratic term is negative. So you're going to have declining marginal returns here as you get more experience. They're all positive, obviously. The means, they're centered around these dots. Those are the means of the data, the means experience, you know, for the groups. You know, so you're talking about, oh, I don't know, at the mean, you know, 7% rate of return to a year, another year, maybe as high as 9%. My reading of literature, those are actually pretty, you know, not far away from what you often get when you just estimate more general models. So nothing surprising there. A little surprising here for women who don't have kids. We get also a slight decline, but a very high rate of return here to experience. And we haven't quite figured out what that is. If those women in our PSID sample have different occupations than the others, where you really do lose a lot of human capital if you don't work. That's kind of what this would imply. So we'll see to that. Okay, so bottom line here, we're trying to do a projection of the effect of the recession. So how are we going to do that? We're going to go 1 year out. We're going to take our estimated model, our baseline specification, and the baseline specification, the wage in 2021 is going to be a function of a work experience as of 2020. And we're going to do a counterfactual exercise in the actual one. The counterfactual is, and you can do many different counterfactuals here. We just said, suppose that in 2020, we had had exactly the same employment business cycle effect, in other words, as we had in 2019. Now in 2019, there was you know, pretty good growth year. So most of those employment shocks were positive. We could also just say, well, what if they all went away in the counterfactual and there were 0 employment shocks in 2020 in the absence of COVID? So they're all going to be additive though, you know, so it's not, it will certainly change the magnitudes though. And so right now, all we've done is assume that the 2019 stage of the business cycle was exactly replicated in 2020 for the counterfactual. And then the pandemic effect is just plug in the actual 2020 employment shocks, see what impact those have on experience, and then just take the diff, you know, in the projected 2021 wages. That's it. So not complicated. And so we're going to take those employment shocks for whether the counterfactual or the actual first predict the effects of those on experience, and then plug that in the wage equation and see the impacts on wages. Okay. And we're going to, for the baseline here, ignore childcare and school closures, and we'll do a calibration for that. Very hard. I'll get to why, but the PSID can't estimate that directly. So here's the overall impact for the whole sample. Well, separated by group, but still no subgroup effects or interactions or anything like that. And so you see here, it's not surprising that the effect of, you know, 1 year, 2020, no matter how bad it is not going to affect, you know, mean experience that much. So our projection of counterfactual for married women mothers is 12.125 years they would have had, you know. This is at the mean of the data, okay? So there's a distribution. But what actually happened was only 12.09. I mean, I guess the maximum could have been like 1 if every single woman, you know, didn't work the whole year. But this is just an average. It's 1.4% reduction, okay, is what it is. And then you see these other ones. The biggest negatives are actually for the single moms, actually. Again, not surprising given those other results, is what our projections say. The smallest is for the married women with no children, smallest negative impact on full-time experience. Okay, and then for the hourly wage rate, though, the interesting thing is the hourly wage rates, you know, don't come out all as much different as the experience goes, which is just telling you this is a combination of 2 things. What's the impact on experience? And then what's the, you know, payoff to that in the wage equation? And for example, for unmarried women, they have the biggest negative impacts, but in fact, their rate of return to experience is not that high. So even though they had the biggest negative impact, they didn't have the biggest, that much different than the negative wage impacts for other people, and smallest for married, no kids. Okay, so let me get to some other stuff. I'll skip this. That shows the distributions. So what we find, and maybe I'll just kind of whiz through this. By industry, we find actually what we expected, which is on the wage equations here. If you were in a hard-hit industry, a woman worked for that, we're forecasting that these are all negative numbers, and higher the bar, the more negative the impact. Always bigger, no matter what marital status group you're in, if you were employed in a industry that was hard hit by COVID. So that came out the way we expected. Some groups by region, I'm not sure how to interpret these. It turns out the Northeast, for some reason, had the biggest negative wage impacts. Maybe that's because of the industries located there. On spouse, it turns out that only for the married mothers was there much of a difference, but we found that if your husband was in a non-male dominated industry, actually it had a more negative impact on the wage than if your spouse was in a male-dominated industry. There's probably just some industry differences there, and so not sure about that. On the childcare and school closures, so childcare, the PSID has some data on childcare, which says that only 25% of women use it. And if you believe that number, you're not going to get a big impact, because if only 25% of women were using childcare to begin with, even if it fell to zero, that's only 1/4 of the women that were going to be affected, and it didn't fall to zero, especially for the whole year. So we made some back of the envelope calculations saying, suppose that fell to by half, 12%, and made some other assumptions. And what we're going to do is go to our equation and kind of ratio up that negative impact of having a 0 to 5 preschool kid, and say, well, how much greater that would be. But we really don't have, and we're going to have to get some more data on this, is school attendance. How many women were not working because of the school closures? Like all the schools closed, but we have actually, we started off with too big a number. We just said, suppose that the reduction in employment from having a school-age kid 6 to 12 was 50% greater than it actually was in past recessions. And what we found here was that if you look at the impacts, negative impacts of COVID, the recession, were much greater for a 6 to 12-year-old women with 6 to 12-year-old kids. And that's just baked into our assumptions, really, because so few of the preschool women were using childcare to begin with, that the effects were much smaller. So we got more work to do there, but it's a question. Okay, there might be bigger impacts there. In other words, on longer impacts, I'm nothing to say here. We haven't done it yet. Whether it's time off from work to have a child or whatever, whether it has a long run impact, how long it takes to get back to the wage rate you were at before the event happened. Big literature on that. PSID is not great for that, but we can use our lags here a little bit to try to estimate the fade out effects, and we'll do that. So I said I had a long list, but let me mention things that we're missing. Only 4 of them, I'm sure. In the Q&A, you'll mention 20 more. So, what's missing, like I said at the beginning, the unusual shape of the recession makes our use of these annual averages in business cycle shocks of doubtful, validity. So that's really a question. Although you might think that the impact of the pandemic recession is not as great as it would have been in some of those more long-lasting recessions, which were more persistent. It's an open question. Small n, we're not really able to drill down to the industry and occupations we really want to. That's just a limitation I have to point out. I feel like I should, at least. And like I said, we have more work to do on calibration. We're thinking about getting the pulse data. If any of you know what the pulse data is, the Census Bureau survey that is kind of real time, week by week, that has pretty good information, although response error is an issue with it. And then just to say, the long run effects here of the pandemic recession, lots of people have talked about that. We have nothing to really contribute there, but is work from home going to be a persistent fact of life? Are the kinds of firms that are out there and their labor demand, is that going to change? Are there going to be some permanent changes in and dining, transportation, groceries has gone up after all, and are those going to persist? We don't know. Those are all open questions. And what about the husband, like the one paper I mentioned, her husband's going to permanently change the amount of time they spend at home. These are all very interesting questions, but not things we're going to be able to address. So we wouldn't pretend to be able to say anything about that. So anyway, that's it. So let me stop there and turn it back to Kevin.
Thank you, Robert. That's really fascinating. I want to remind people to use the chat to ask questions. You were also, you were very clear, Robert, so I don't think you're going to have a lot of clarifying questions. Let me ask you something. You've sort of focused on human capital, but there's a literature that says that there's a signaling element of non-employment. Right? There's, the old paper from Gibbons and Katz about plant closing versus layoffs. There's some issues with that paper, but I sure wish I'd written it. And my colleague Lindo has a paper on the negative signaling aspects of maternity leave. You have any thoughts about whether that's likely to be different in the COVID-induced recession, and how generally that will affect your estimates?
Well, I can speculate, this like anybody, but I guess I would have thought, like what you think, Kevin, is that that signaling impact would be less in the pandemic recession. We have obviously incredibly exogenous shock here in a virus, and the school closures and the childcare closures and closing all the restaurants. I mean, that's if a woman or man for that reason, is laid off because of that, that wouldn't seem to me, at least the immediate impact would not, be very, negative signal producing to employers. Now, maybe as we get more into this, the Republicans are certainly arguing that there is a negative signaling impact with UI, and people not working voluntarily now. But that would be my first thought about that. I think this is, I wish other people would kind of work on, on these different types of reasons for not working, and the signaling. That's good. That's an interesting one I hadn't thought of. Might very well make their effects quite different, on future wage rates and employer attitudes, something like that. I don't know. I'd have to ask other people who are a little bit more on the motherhood penalty side if that's part of the, part of maybe what's going on there as well. I don't know. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that, Kevin?
I don't know. I was actually scrolling through the list of participants to see if there were any experts on the Great Depression, because that would seem to be a case where if the argument about signaling is important, you would think that, well, being unemployed in the Great Depression might not have been a bad signal given how high unemployment rates were, but I have no idea if they were or not. Anybody in the audience who jumps out at me as an expert on that. I have to say I share your expectations, but I don't know. I don't know.
Well, yeah. Plus, some of these unemployment spells, and we don't have spell data here, but these are pretty long unemployment spells, right? Starting in March 2020, and if you look at that one paper I cited, just published like 2 weeks ago, a lot of these women are still, they're not back, they're not back full time. That's a year, and that's serious stuff to have an unemployment spell. Even in recessions, you don't get that many people who go for a full year, without work. So yeah, you think it might, okay, but I don't know. Really good question.
might help us actually try to identify why there are large costs along unemployment.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because this is so different.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think, you know, it's relevant to the long run impact of this too, you know, and which we'll have to wait to see. But that may be a reason for not a long run. Maybe our, like I said, I'm a little, if I had to guess any way, I would say our estimates are probably overestimates of the negative impact, you know, because of the exogenous nature of it and the very special nature of it. I hope I'm right that there turned out not to be very large effects, and I hope that you know, as the economy recovers, you kind of wonder too whether or not in a recession, you know, the whole economy, like everybody's out of work, right? You talk about signaling value, you know, like everybody. So it's not, there's nothing unique, you know, to a particular person for having not worked for a while. So they're all going to come back, right? And the employers are going to help bring them all back up to speed, and let's get back to work the way we were before. And, you know, maybe the impacts will be quite small for that reason as well.
Okay, we're looking for some more questions. We have about 5 minutes left. We can handle a few more questions. And I know it takes people time to type. I don't know if you can raise your hand. If you can raise your hand, I can unmute you. And I'm not sure whether we gave you that option.
Yeah. Let me just say,
yes, there are people. So I'm going to allow Joe Altanji first, and then I'm going to also allow Margie McAvoy. So Joe, you're on.
Robert, it's very interesting, interesting talk. I guess like maybe 3 suggestions. One of them is to show the estimates in some sense conditional on getting on them, being affected, that is actually having a, you know, a disemployment spell, which you can kind of more or less compute, but it's the average, of course, is many people, you know, weren't affected. The second that I wondered about whether this recession might be a bit different is the fraction of people who go back to their original employer. There was probably more temporary, the evidence, I think the CPS evidence suggests that. And so I think that might be interesting to look at. The third thing is that, you know, I don't really think of unemployment spells as just operating through the quantity of experience you have. That is, there's a direct effect of losing a job match and then having to go find a new employer. So you could, for example, use other methods, other variation in the data to estimate the effect of experience, and then potentially sort out the consequences of a disemployment spell.
yeah, Joe, that's those are all very good questions, and in fact, you know, and there may be very unique aspects to COVID, you know, along all those dimensions. You know, some of these employers have closed altogether, you know, and gone under, particularly the restaurants and things like that. And so you may be forced into a different job match. And, you know, I mean, like the models you've worked on, where you have to hunt around for a while before you find the best match, and you keep, you know, changing for a little while until you find a good one. You know, that could be very operative here. On the other hand, if the firm did not close, you know, I think there's a reasonable chance that, you know, they will bring people back, you know. I don't know. I mean, I only know what I read in the newspaper and follow the news. And so, I mean, a lot of these employers, you know, are opening up. They don't have quite as many jobs, all the jobs they had at the beginning. So there's some shortage. You know, they say they're not able to find, you know, the restaurants say they aren't able to find people right now. But that's a very, I mean, I could certainly look at that as an impact, you know, what both occupation change, job change, and those could have kind of a those could be a mechanism through which, you know, negative wage effects could occur. And your other points too, spell length and the job, the employer occupation aspect. Was there another question, Kevin?
Margie, Margie, you want to ask the last question?
Yeah, this isn't so much a question as just a very simple comment, and that is being unemployed and searching is a really different signal than being out of the labor force, and you might be able to exploit that. So that's it.
Okay. Yeah, great. Okay, well, let me just say, as I said in the beginning, I'm really eager for people's comments. Please email me if you have any thoughts or ideas on it, and especially citations to papers if they're relevant to what I'm talking about. Okay, Kevin.
So Robert, thank you very much. This really was very, very interesting. And want to remind people that the Gather is open to go see your friends or meet new people. And the next set of sessions start in about 17 minutes. So join me in thanking Robert for a great talk. I know most of you can't unmute, but we know that it's happening virtually. So thank you again and enjoy the conference.
See you later.
Bye-bye.